Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we dare not go a-hunting for fear of little men. Green jacket, red cap, and the white owl's feather. Wee folk, good folk, trooping all together. Down along the rocky shore, some make their home. They live on crispy pancakes of the yellow tide foam. Down in the reeds of the black mountain lake, with frogs as their watchdogs, all night awake. They stole little Bridget for 7 years long. When she came back down again, her friends were all gone. They took her lightly back between the night and morrow. They thought her fast asleep, but she was dead with sorrow. They have kept her ever since, deep within the lake, on a bed of flagon leaves, watching till she wakes. Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we dare not go a-hunting for fear of little men. In cultures all over the world, people tell tales of the little folk, the wee folk. Now, they're called different things in different places. In Hawaii, they're called menehune. In Mexico, duendes, chaneques, aluches. In Indonesia, they're called the ebu gogo, the ugly uncle. Now, the stories exist everywhere, but they always do the same things. They're always these little folk, human-like, but not quite human. And they always do the same things. They harass humans. They play tricks on them. Sometimes they're very nasty tricks. Sometimes they steal from humans, possessions, chickens, livestock. And sometimes they say that we folk steal human children. Now, these stories, since they exist everywhere, many people have said that there might just be some sort of truth behind them. And this is one of those stories. This one comes from Ireland, and it was collected by Lady Wilde, the mother of author Oscar Wilde. This is my version of that story. Mary and her husband Liam, they lay in bed one night. They lived in just a little one-room hut, a one-room cabin out there in Ireland, out there on the plains, on the moors. And it was a windy night, and Mary, she just couldn't sleep that night. She sat there. The fire was kind of crackling in the fireplace. The crib with their baby was right next to the fireplace. She just kind of lay there staring at the flames. Then a big gust of wind blew, and it blew the door open, slammed the door open. And with it, she looked and she saw two people coming into her hut. Now, her husband, he was still asleep. Next to her, Liam was sleeping. These people, the first man, he was a tall, gaunt, dressed all in black, very dark, very sinister looking. And he walked in hunched over, and behind him came this twisted, cragged old woman, and she was carrying a bundle. Looked like she was carrying a baby, but it looked somehow misshapen and sickly. When they came in, Mary said they must just be freezing out there in the wind. They must have come in to come sit by the fire and warm themselves, but they didn't do that. No, they actually came in and they walked to the opposite end of the cabin and sat over there in the cold darkness and the shadows, as far from the fire as they could. Mary looked over at them, and that tall, gaunt man, he was just staring fixedly at the cradle, staring at it. Well, Mary, she called out to them to see who they were or what they wanted. She called out, but they didn't answer. So she picked up a candle she had nearby to light it. She could barely make them out. She wanted to see them better. So she lit that candle and held it up, and that old woman, clear from across the house, blew the candle out. Well, Mary, she lit it again. Again, that old woman from the other end of the cabin, she blew out the candle flame. Then the third time that Mary lit it, the door slammed open again with another gust of wind, and that wind, it blew out the candle, and it blew out the fire in the fireplace. And there in the darkness, Mary heard this terrible peal of laughter, wicked cackling, fill the cabin. Well, that woke up Liam too. So they scrambled, looked for a candle to light again. This time it stayed lit, and they lit the fire again. That old woman and that tall, gaunt man, they were gone. They were nowhere to be found. And then they heard the baby crying from the crib. But it was different. It was strange. It wasn't their normal baby's cry. And they walked over to the crib and they looked in horror when they saw that it was not their baby. In the crib was a hideous creature, all covered in hair, sitting there just grinning at them with long, sharp teeth. When they saw that, they burst into wails. They went outside looking for those strangers. They didn't see them anywhere out on the moors or in the hills or in the forest, and they just stood there on the porch holding each other, wailing, weeping unconsolably, because they knew what had happened, that it was the fairy folk. Well, many people are afraid to even say their names, so they call them the good folk. The good folk, who are not so good all the time, had come and switched out their baby, their human baby, for a changeling of the fairy folk. Now they stood there crying, and then they heard a voice, and someone tapped them on the back. There's a young lady there with a red head kerchief. They didn't even hear her come up. She said, What's wrong? Why are you crying? And Mary and Liam told her what had happened, and they brought her inside and showed her in the crib that hideous creature covered in hair. Now, when the woman looked in that crib, she just smiled as big as she could. She broke into laughter. They said, What kind of a cruel, why would you laugh at this horrible thing? She said, No, you don't understand. That's my baby. I've been looking for him. That's my baby. It was my folk who did this to you. They did this to you. They set their eye on your baby. But he may look ugly to you, this baby, but he's mine. He's the most beautiful thing in the world for me. And I want nothing but my own baby back. So I'll tell you what, if I can take my baby, I will tell you how to get your son back. So they gave that creature to her. She took it tenderly. And she said, I'll tell you, go up to the top of the hill, up there, the fairy fort. Everyone knows where the fairy fort is. Go up to that fairy fort. They're all over Ireland, these fairy forts. Some people think they just look like mounds, but folks who know the old ways know better, that the fairy folk are inside, sometimes invisible and sometimes not, but they're in there. She said, go to the fairy fort, and you need to bring fire and bring 3 sheaves of corn. And you go up there and light that first sheaf of corn, and an old man will appear to you. And when he does, you threaten to burn down the fairy fort. See, my people, the fairy folk, we cannot stand against fire. It's something we have no power against. So you go up there, you threaten to burn it down, and he will give you your son back. And then when he does, take your son back here and draw a circle around his crib with a burning hot coal. That'll be your protection against any fairy power. And from then on, you put an iron nail from a horseshoe, hang that around his neck, because everyone knows that fire and iron, those are 2 things that fairies cannot stand against. Now that's true. You should all know that, just for your own sake. So they did that. They did what the young woman told the next night. The next night they took a lit torch, took some fire, and they took 3 sheaves of corn, and they walked through that windy night and walked out to where that fairy fort stood at the top of the hill. And Liam, he lit the first sheaf of corn, lit it up, and in the smoke from that corn, in the fire, they looked, and just briefly they could see an old craggy man's face. It appeared behind the smoke, just sort of diaphanous, and then disappeared. Well, he lit the second sheaf of corn, lit it up, and then that old man appeared. He was more solid this time. He stood there. Liam just looked at him and said, "Give me my son back." The man laughed and disappeared. So Liam took that fire and he called out to everyone, all the invisible people in that fairy fort. He called out to them. He said, "I'm lighting the 3rd sheaf of corn now. If you do not give me my son back, I will burn down your fort. I'll burn every last tree on this fort. I will smash every rock. There'll be nary a stone for your people to live in forever. And when he said that, that old man appeared again in the smoke, and he begrudgingly held out a bundle. He said, "Here, take him." It was their son. They had him back. Well, they hurried back home. They took their son, and they did just as the fairy woman with the red kerchief had told them. They put their son back in the crib. They drew that circle around with the hot coal. They put the iron horseshoe nail around his neck, and he grew up to a ripe old age. He was fit and healthy. And that fairy fort, it still stands there to this day. And you know why? Because Liam has looked out for it. Because they gave him his son back, Liam has stood guard over that fairy fort. He won't let anyone cut a single tree down from there or move a stone from there. And the fairies, they still live there. And they still come out and they dance to the sound of their pipes. They dance there every full moon. And if you go there, you can see them dancing too. They're real. Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we dare not go a hunting for fear of little men. We folk, good folk, trooping all together, green jacket, red cap, and the white owl's feather. The Changeling, a story collected by Lady Wilde.